The winter of 1918 was colder than usual. Across America, rivers froze, fields turned to ice, and the air itself seemed brittle. At Camp Funston, a military base in Kansas, 30,000 men were training to fight in the Great War. They drilled in the cold, their breath forming clouds against the gray sky. They were young, eager, and ready to be sent across the ocean. But something unseen was already moving among them. It did not march or fire a weapon. It was silent, microscopic, and it would become far deadlier than any army. On the morning of March 4th, an army cook named Albert Gitchell reported sick. He had a high fever, aches, and a terrible cough. By noon, more than 100 soldiers had fallen ill with the same symptoms. By nightfall, the infirmary was overflowing. Doctors called it influenza, the flu, a common enough ailment that usually passed in a few days. They did not know this strain was different. They had no way of seeing the tiny virus under their microscopes, and no way of imagining that this single outbreak would soon engulf the planet. Within days, more than 1,000 men were sick. The base doctor, Edward Schreiner, noted the symptoms: fever, headache, sore throat, exhaustion. He isolated the sick and gave them rest, and most recovered. The Army command paid little attention. Flu was not an enemy to be feared. Troops had to be shipped out to Europe, and nothing could slow the war effort. Within weeks, the camp emptied as thousands of men boarded trains and ships bound for the front. The virus went with them. In March 1918, ships left New York, Boston, and Philadelphia loaded with soldiers. Each crossing took 8 days. On board, the crowded, unventilated holds were perfect breeding grounds for infection. A platoon of the sick became a battalion of victims by the time they reached Europe. Soldiers carried the virus to Liverpool, Brest, Bordeaux, and Marseille. The disease spread faster than anyone could track. It crossed borders silently, hidden in the lungs of men who didn't even know they were sick. In the early months, it seemed mild. Many recovered quickly. The death rate was low. Newspapers mentioned it briefly, but no one panicked. There was a war to fight, and soldiers were dying on the battlefield in far greater numbers. Governments and military leaders had no time to worry about an illness that looked like a bad cold. But beneath that calm surface, something deadly was evolving. The virus was mutating, adapting to its new hosts, learning how to kill. In France, the first American troops arrived in the spring of 1918. They marched through villages and towns on their way to the front, shaking hands, hugging old friends, buying bread, and sharing laughter. With every breath, they left behind a trace of the invisible enemy. It spread along train lines and through ports, from one region to another. The French called it the grippe. The British called it the Flanders flu. It struck soldiers on both sides of the trenches, and for a moment, it seemed like the only enemy that didn't care what uniform a man wore. The first wave swept through Europe in the spring. Soldiers grew sick in the trenches, coughing, sweating, shivering. Thousands were bedridden, but few died. Military doctors treated them, noted the strange rapid spread, and moved on. There were bigger battles to fight. The press said little. Military censorship kept reports of the illness quiet to preserve morale. The war demanded silence. The only country to tell the truth was Spain. As a neutral nation, its newspapers were not censored. In May 1918, reports emerged from Madrid of an epidemic sweeping the country. Even King Alfonso XIII fell ill. His court and government ministers were bedridden. Spain's free press became the first to report on the outbreak, and the world, mistaking the messenger for the source, called it the Spanish flu. By summer, the disease had spread across Europe. It moved through ports, railways, and troop convoys. It reached Russia, Italy, Greece, and as far as Iceland and China. The number of cases exploded, but death rates remained moderate. Doctors and soldiers began to relax, believing the worst was over. In Germany, General Ludendorff complained about the flu's effect on his troops, but saw it as an inconvenience, not a disaster. Even when whole brigades were temporarily incapacitated, the war continued. In England, a few doctors sounded the alarm. In Manchester, Dr. James Niven noticed how quickly entire schools and workplaces fell ill. Children fainted at their desks, teachers collapsed mid-sentence, and within days, thousands were bedridden. Niven advocated simple precautions: hand washing, isolation, avoiding crowds, ideas far ahead of their time. But his warnings were ignored. The war overshadowed everything. The government's focus remained on victory, not contagion. By the end of June 1918, the virus had traveled around the world. In the United States, returning troops brought it home. In France, it spread from the front lines to civilian towns. In Africa, in Asia, in the islands of the Pacific, outbreaks appeared simultaneously, carried by ships and soldiers. The first global pandemic of the modern era had begun. At first, it was an invisible shadow that moved wherever people went. It infected workers in factories, sailors on ships, children in schools. In cities like London, Paris, and New York, people coughed on trams, sneezed in offices, and shook hands in crowded markets, unaware they were passing on a killer. The disease moved through the arteries of civilization itself, trade routes, railways, and ports. By the middle of 1918, nearly every continent had cases. But the world still did not understand what it faced. The flu was not yet deadly enough to provoke fear. Most victims recovered in a week. Doctors assumed it was a seasonal outbreak that would soon fade, as flu always did. There was no reason to close borders or cancel parades. Soldiers continued to ship out. Civilians crowded into theaters, churches, and factories. Life went on. But deep inside human lungs, the virus was changing. Influenza is a master of mutation. Every new infection is an opportunity for it to adapt. The first wave had spread so widely that it gave the virus a global laboratory of hosts to experiment in. By late summer, a new strain emerged, faster, stronger, and infinitely more lethal. The world had unknowingly armed its enemy. In July 1918, the first signs of the second wave appeared in Switzerland. Authorities noticed the disease returning, but far more severe. Soldiers who caught it died within days, their lungs filling with fluid, their skin turning blue from lack of oxygen. The Swiss government responded quickly, banning gatherings and closing public venues. It was the only nation to do so. Elsewhere, leaders refused to act. The war was still the priority, and slowing troop movements was unthinkable. In August, reports of the new deadly strain arrived from Sierra Leone, a British colony in West Africa. A refueling ship carrying infected crew members docked in Freetown. Local dock workers caught the flu, and within days, hundreds were sick. Within weeks, tens of thousands were infected. The virus spread inland along railways and rivers, carried by laborers and traders. In less than a month, nearly a third of the country's population was ill. From there, it moved north and east into Nigeria, Ghana, and beyond. Africa, already weakened by war and colonization, was about to face one of its worst disasters. At the same time, the virus returned to America. At Camp Devens near Boston, soldiers began collapsing in alarming numbers. What doctors first thought was a routine flu turned out to be something far more deadly. Within hours, men developed high fevers, coughed up blood, and turned blue from oxygen deprivation. Their lungs filled so quickly that many drowned in their own fluids. The base hospital, built for a few hundred patients, was crammed with thousands. Nurses and doctors fell ill. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. One military physician wrote, "It is hard to distinguish the colored men from the white. The faces of all are blue." Another recalled watching men die within hours of their first symptoms. The medical community was helpless. There were no antivirals, no antibiotics, and no vaccines. Science, for all its progress, had no defense against this invisible killer. By September, the flu had spread from military bases to civilian cities. Boston was first, then Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago. The death toll soared. Hospitals overflowed, doctors worked without rest, and nurses died in droves. Still, public events went on. In Philadelphia, city officials ignored medical warnings and held a massive parade on September 28th to raise money for the war. 200,000 people crowded the streets, waving flags, cheering soldiers, singing patriotic songs. 3 days later, every hospital bed in the city was full. Within a week, 4,000 people were dead. The Spanish flu, as the world called it, had shown its true face. The second wave had begun. The world was now at war with two enemies, one human, one viral. The battlefields of Europe were littered with bodies, but so were the streets of its cities. Soldiers fell in the trenches without a shot fired. Civilians collapsed in their homes and offices. The virus respected no borders, no ranks, and no peace treaties. It would kill an estimated 50 million people before it was done, more than all the deaths of the First World War combined. But in the autumn of 1918, no one could yet imagine the scale of what was coming. Governments remained silent, newspapers censored the truth, and the world carried on in ignorance. The Spanish flu had become the most efficient killer in human history, and it was only getting started. By the autumn of 1918, the world was already broken by war. Soldiers fought and died across Europe, while cities mourned their fallen sons. But something far deadlier than bullets or shells was now on the march. The virus that had quietly spread through spring and summer had transformed into a monster. It killed faster than anyone thought possible. The second wave of the Spanish flu had begun, and this time it would not spare the young, the strong, or the healthy. In September, the disease struck Philadelphia with devastating force. Doctors had warned the city's leaders not to hold public gatherings, but the government ignored them. On September 28th, 200,000 people flooded the streets for a massive parade to support the war effort. Children waved flags, brass bands played, soldiers marched proudly through the crowd. But hidden among them were the infected, coughing into the air. Within 3 days, every hospital in Philadelphia was overwhelmed. The disease spread like fire through the packed neighborhoods. Coffins ran out, morgues overflowed, and bodies piled up in the streets. By early October, the city had become a graveyard. The smell of death filled the air. Families kept their loved ones' bodies in their homes for days because no one came to collect them. Trolleys ran empty, schools closed, and life simply stopped. One newspaper described Philadelphia as a city of ghosts. It was the same story across America. Boston, New York, Chicago, and San Francisco all fell to the same invisible enemy. The sick died within hours, their lungs turning to liquid. Many suffocated in their own blood. The speed and brutality of the virus defied everything doctors knew. Ordinary influenza killed the weak, the elderly, the very young, those already ill. But this flu did the opposite. It struck the healthiest people hardest. Men and women in their 20s and 30s, the age group that made up the armies and factories of the world, were the ones dying fastest. Scientists later discovered why. The virus triggered what's called a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that flooded the lungs with fluid. The stronger a person's immune system, the more violently it reacted, turning the body's defense into its own executioner. Hospitals were powerless. There were no vaccines, no antivirals, not even antibiotics to treat the pneumonia that followed. Medical supplies ran out. Nurses wrapped themselves in cloth masks, soaked in disinfectant. Doctors worked until they collapsed, some dying beside their patients. Across the country, schools, churches, and theaters were turned into emergency hospitals. Priests gave last rites over rows of the dying, their voices muffled by masks. But even in the face of catastrophe, officials often refused to tell the truth. Censorship laws passed during the war made it illegal to publish anything that might hurt national morale. Newspapers reported that the situation was under control even as death tolls soared. In Washington, the Surgeon General declared that there is no cause for alarm. In cities where people were dropping dead in the streets, headlines insisted the flu was just a bad cold. Fear was treated as a greater enemy than the virus itself. Europe fared no better. In France, the hospitals of Paris were full. Nurses and soldiers fell side by side. In Britain, Londoners buried their dead in mass graves. Public gatherings were banned, and even funerals were limited to a few mourners. The great cities of the world, New York, Paris, London, Bombay, all echoed with the same sounds: coughing, crying, and silence. In India, the epidemic struck with a ferocity unmatched anywhere else. Returning soldiers carried the flu to Bombay, and from there, it spread along the railways to every corner of the country. Villages were wiped out completely. The Ganges River filled with corpses, some burned on funeral pyres, others were left to drift downstream. It's estimated that between 10 and 20 million Indians died in just a few months, the largest single loss of life in any nation during the pandemic. The same story played out around the world. In Africa, the virus spread along colonial trade routes, killing workers, farmers, and soldiers alike. In South Africa, entire communities vanished. In Alaska, the disease reached remote Inuit villages, brought by mail carriers and traders. Some villages lost every inhabitant. In Western Samoa, 1 in 5 people died after a single infected ship docked. On islands where life had gone unchanged for centuries, the modern world arrived carrying death. What made this pandemic so terrifying was not just the number of deaths, but how quickly it struck. In many cases, a person could wake up feeling fine and be dead by nightfall. The flu began with fever and fatigue, then came coughing and difficulty breathing. Within hours, the skin of victims turned blue or even black from lack of oxygen. Some bled from the nose, ears, and eyes. Others collapsed in the street, choking as their lungs filled with fluid. Doctors described seeing bodies stacked in hallways like firewood. Coffin makers could not keep up. Cities ran out of wood. In some towns, they buried the dead in mass pits without ceremony. It's hard to imagine the scale of the despair. Streets were empty, schools silent, churches closed. In some places, even the undertakers had died. In others, survivors banded together to care for orphans and the sick. Entire families disappeared in days. In New York, volunteers drove horse-drawn wagons down the streets, calling for people to bring out their dead. One observer wrote, "It was as if the world had stopped breathing." The war made everything worse. Troop movements ensured that no corner of the world could escape. In France, where soldiers lived in mud-filled trenches, the virus thrived in the damp, overcrowded conditions. The German army, already starving from Allied blockades, suffered so many sick that they could no longer fight effectively. Some historians believe the flu hastened the end of the First World War itself. Armies were too weak to continue. On November 11, 1918, when the armistice was signed, soldiers on both sides celebrated in the streets. But as the church bells rang and the crowds cheered, the virus was still spreading among them. Peace had come too late for millions. The second wave peaked in late 1918. By then, the death toll had reached catastrophic levels. In just a few months, tens of millions were dead. Entire communities had been erased from the map. Hospitals were graveyards. Cities were filled with the sound of wagon wheels carrying corpses. There was no part of the planet untouched. In Europe, America, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific, the same invisible enemy ruled. And yet, when the wave finally began to subside, the world was too exhausted to understand what had happened. By December, in some cities, infection rates began to fall. People dared to hope that the worst was over. But the virus was not finished. It lingered, mutating again, preparing for a third and final assault. For a brief moment, humanity caught its breath. Survivors emerged from their homes. The sick began to recover, and life resumed its fragile rhythm. But in the coming months, the Spanish flu would return once more, not as fierce as before, but still deadly enough to finish what it had begun. The world had survived its deadliest wave, but it had not yet escaped. The soldiers who had gone to war to defeat one enemy had unwittingly carried another that killed far more. In the span of a single season, the Spanish flu had transformed the modern world into a graveyard. The dead outnumbered the soldiers lost in 4 years of war. The scale of death was so vast that entire governments struggled to count the bodies. Humanity had endured plague before, but never one that moved so fast, killed so indiscriminately, and reached so far. By the time the second wave ended, the Spanish flu had reshaped the world, but it was not yet history. In the winter that followed, the third wave would rise, weaker but still merciless. It would sweep through the exhausted nations one last time before fading into memory. The deadliest pandemic in human history was not done. It had one more chapter to write. By the start of 1919, the world was a different place. The Great War was over, but peace brought no relief. Cities that had celebrated the armistice now lay quiet, shrouded in mourning. The second wave of the influenza pandemic had passed, leaving behind millions of dead and tens of millions more weak, sick, or grieving. But the virus was not gone. Like a storm retreating to the horizon, it gathered its strength once more. The third wave of the Spanish flu was about to begin. It struck in the cold months of early 1919. In many places, it arrived without warning. People were weary of illness and loss. They wanted to move on. Governments lifted restrictions, and life slowly resumed. Crowds returned to streets and factories. Soldiers came home from Europe, and communities began to rebuild. But among the returning troops were new carriers. The virus, mutated yet again, moved silently with them. In January, it erupted in Paris, then spread across France, Britain, and the United States. Though weaker than before, it was still deadly. Hospitals filled once more. Doctors and nurses who had survived the previous wave found themselves repeating the same desperate routines. The disease still killed quickly, not as explosively as in 1918, but enough to reignite fear. In some towns, the third wave was as lethal as the first. In others, it passed with fewer victims. The world was too exhausted to react with the same urgency as before. In many cities, leaders refused to reimpose quarantines. People simply endured. In the spring of 1919, the pandemic spread again to Asia, Africa, and South America. In India, it claimed hundreds of thousands more lives. In Japan, thousands died within weeks. In Australia, strict maritime quarantines delayed its arrival, but eventually, even the island continent succumbed. Entire communities along its coasts were struck down. The flu had become truly global, reaching every corner of the earth, from tropical islands to Arctic villages. By mid-1919, the virus began to burn itself out. So many people had either died or developed immunity that there were fewer and fewer hosts left to infect. Slowly, the number of cases declined. The third wave faded into the background, and the world emerged, blinking into the light of a new age. But the toll it left behind was unimaginable. Between 50 and 100 million people had died, more than the total killed in both world wars combined. Entire families had vanished. In some places, 1 out of every 10 people was gone. In others, entire villages were erased from history. The survivors were haunted by what they had seen. In the United States alone, over 675,000 people had died. In India, up to 20 million were gone. In Europe, millions more. In Africa, the flu killed entire communities, often without record or recognition. In the Pacific, small islands lost half their populations. The virus had touched every human society on Earth, from the wealthiest capitals to the most remote settlements. It was the first truly global catastrophe of the modern age. And yet, within a few years, it was almost forgotten. Part of the reason was timing. The world had just survived 4 years of war that claimed 20 million lives. The influenza pandemic struck as the guns fell silent. The exhausted populations and governments had no appetite for more grief. Newspapers, once censored for morale, turned their focus to peace treaties and reconstruction. The dead were buried quietly, their stories overshadowed by political headlines. There were no monuments for the victims of the Spanish flu, no parades for the nurses and doctors who had risked their lives. Humanity moved on without ceremony, but the scars it left ran deep. The pandemic changed societies in ways that would last for generations. In cities where public health systems had collapsed, governments began to rethink the role of medicine. The need for international cooperation in fighting disease became obvious. New institutions and health departments were founded. The seeds of modern epidemiology were planted in the ashes of 1918. Scientists began to understand that viruses could travel farther, mutate faster, and kill more efficiently than any known plague. The microscopic world had revealed its power, and humanity would never again underestimate it. Even the virus itself did not disappear completely. The strain of influenza that caused the pandemic, later identified as H1N1, continued to circulate for decades, slowly mutating into less deadly forms. It would resurface again in 2009 in a new variant, a reminder that history never truly ends, it only sleeps. The Spanish flu became the blueprint for understanding pandemics. Every outbreak since, from SARS to COVID-19, has been measured against it. The lessons learned from 1918 are still the foundation of how we respond to global disease today. The pandemic also reshaped culture and perception. In its wake came a global silence about death. Families that lost everything rarely spoke of it. Art, literature, and music of the early 1920s carried an undercurrent of melancholy. The Roaring Twenties, with its wild parties and defiant optimism, was more than an age of prosperity. It was a rebellion against the memory of grief. Humanity had stared into the abyss and survived. People wanted to live, to forget, to dance again, but some never could. The flu left behind countless orphans and widows. Entire generations grew up in its shadow. Many survivors suffered from long-term health effects, though at the time no one understood why. Depression, fatigue, and neurological problems lingered for years. What today might be called post-viral syndromes. The virus had not only killed millions, it had changed millions more. There is something haunting about the way the world forgot the Spanish flu. It was the deadliest event in human history, yet it vanished from collective memory within a generation. No grand memorial marks its victims. Few films or books were written about it. Perhaps it was too vast to comprehend, or perhaps the silence was a kind of mercy. People wanted to believe they had defeated death, not merely survived it. Looking back now, the story of the 1918 pandemic feels eerily familiar. The world was connected then as it is now, through ships, trade, and movement. The same mistakes were made: denial, censorship, and the belief that life could continue unchanged. The same heroes emerged: doctors, nurses, and ordinary people risking everything for others. The same truth revealed itself, that the smallest things can bring down the greatest empires. By the time the Spanish flu ended, the world had entered a new era. Medicine advanced, science improved, and humanity began to see disease not as divine punishment, but as a challenge to be understood and overcome. Yet, for all its progress, the fundamental vulnerability of human life remained. We were and are creatures bound together by breath, and it was breath that nearly destroyed us. The Spanish flu was not the first pandemic, nor would it be the last, but it was a turning point. It showed that the modern world, for all its machines and armies, could still be brought to its knees by something invisible. It was a humbling reminder that nature does not need to hate us to destroy us. It only needs to exist. As the 1920s dawned, the survivors stepped into a world changed beyond recognition. Cities were rebuilding, nations redrawing borders, and the hum of life slowly returned. Children played in the streets again. Factories reopened. The war was over, and so, it seemed, was the plague. But the memory lingered in whispers, in diaries, in graveyards, in the eyes of those who had lived through it. The world had survived the deadliest pandemic in history, but it would never be quite the same again. The story of 1918 is not just a story of death, but of endurance. Against a microscopic enemy, humanity had almost fallen, and yet it did not. The flu faded as mysteriously as it came, leaving behind a planet forever changed. Out of its darkness came modern medicine, global cooperation, and a deeper understanding of how fragile life truly is. In the end, the Spanish flu burned itself out, not because of science or medicine, but because of humanity's resilience, its capacity to endure loss, rebuild, and begin again. For all the pain it caused, the world moved forward. The lights came back on, the cities breathed again, and life returned. But beneath that return to normalcy lay a truth we still live with today. The greatest dangers often come without warning, invisible and unstoppable, reminding us that every breath we take is both a gift and a risk. The pandemic of 1918 left no monuments, no victories, no heroes in uniform. But in the quiet courage of nurses who stayed, families who buried their dead, and survivors who rebuilt their lives, humanity found its strength. The deadliest pandemic in history ended not with celebration, but with silence. Yet in that silence, life endured, and that endurance became the greatest triumph of all.